All
Yeah.
right. Welcome.
No, but thank you. And I mean, this is really not only an honor to be spending the evening with everyone, but as I was telling you earlier, we are literally in the process of moving. So you have given me a well-justified excuse to not unpack boxes, and and do something meaningful concurrently. So double win on this
Good.
one.
Whatever I
Um,
can do. And I want to mention to everybody, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Storch. We'll dive into that. I want to mention to anybody, if there's anything that is, I hate to use the word triggering, but that's the word that we use in the industry, or activating something I'm doing, please let me know in the chat, or feel free to come on and just say, Chris, can you please stop doing that thing? I'm happy to abide. I'm glad we could give you a break from moving. Moving is a very stressful thing, but I want to kind of go back, Dr. Storch, if you can introduce yourself a little bit. You're at the Baylor College of Medicine. You're the chair or the vice chair of the department, and you also run the Storch Lab. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be there, and what your boilerplate history of how you got to be where you are is?
yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist by trade, and I've always worked in sort of these anxiety, obsessive compulsive, and sensory based conditions over my career. Now it's funny how life sort of takes you. My first boss was a gentleman named Wayne Goodman at University of Florida, and wherever he went as chair, he tried to recruit me. And so I had been in New York, and he went there, and wasn't going back there. And Too much pizza and delicious food, and so on. But when he came to Baylor, there was an incredible opportunity to really step into both a leadership role as vice chair of the department, but also just the sort of the talent that exists in Houston, and the opportunity to do so many things, many of which weren't things that I would have done at my prior institution, because we didn't have the right folks there necessarily. Um, so I came about 4.5 years ago, and frankly, from day one, it's sort of been this mad dash to something, but with a lot of excitement in terms of the research that's taking place, the clinical work that's taking place, and then a lot of the program development that we do there as well.
Awesome. And you were, if we go back about 10 years, you were one of the first people in the research community at all to research and write about and discuss the need for more research on misophonia. It was, I guess the term was coined in about 2000, 2001. It wasn't discovered then. Those of us who have had it discovered it long before that, but it was discovered as a unique potential disorder around then. And then it kind of languished in obscurity for a little over a decade. And you were one of the first ones to begin publishing about it and bring it a little bit out of the woodwork and say, we need to examine what this is. What brought you to that?
Yeah, we ended up well. So I'm at University of South Florida, and we had really an OCD and anxiety clinic for kids and adults. And I remember seeing within about a week or 2 weeks of each other, two kids who had misophonia. We had never seen this before. We had some expertise with sensory problems, just tactile defensiveness, things like that, which often co-occur with OCD or Tourette's syndrome or other types of problems. And frankly, we didn't really know what to do with it. So the first couple kids, we said, well, let's try this multi-component approach. And so some of that was, how do we get kids to relax themselves? Some was, how do we get them to sort of imagine being in a different place, not focus on the stimuli, but distract. Some of it was learning how to face fears, both kind of direct and then more in a, okay, it's tough, but I have to sit through it. Like when you go to the dentist, you don't like it, but you tolerate it. Um, and so in the first two cases, we actually had a pretty good response. So we left thinking, hey, this is exciting. This is something here. And then we saw a couple more kids, and we tried to extrapolate from the original experience to those kiddos, and boy, did it not work. And so over time, what we ended up learning is that we didn't really have a sense of what worked treatment-wise. We saw that direct exposure was not a very effective approach. In fact, a little bit hurtful. But we also saw this need to make sure that people didn't kind of let misophonia take over their lives. That you still have to figure out how you can be effective, but manage it in different ways. Sort of like if you go out in the sun and heat in Houston, or Texas, you have to figure out how you're gonna wear a hat, or if you're at the beach, you put suntan lotion on, or so on. And again, ways of being effective with with the things that are being dealt. So the other part that we started doing was really trying to research different aspects. How do we measure this, for one? To what degree is it impairing? And again, have that greater sense of those kind of nuances together. And so that was some of our original focus. And then over time, what also happened was that this was good, it was important, but there really wasn't kind of a motivator. And in our field, there's, I'm trying to think how to say this. One of the ways that colleges of medicine operate is through research grants. And so there wasn't a clear mechanism for getting our research funded, for example, for doing treatment trials, or really understanding the condition. And so all that changed several years ago with a really invested family. It changed with groups like soQuiet, and many other groups led by wonderful stakeholders. And so you sort of saw this convergence of advocates coming into play that really has I think motivated the research field. Much of that is also driven by individuals who are struggling with this and participating in research, or kind of lending their voice to try to address misophonia. And so all that together, I think, has sort of addressed this lull that I think happened after this initial wave, and really stymied a lot of enthusiasm and excitement and advances within the field.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's an interesting time. We were discussing this right before the meeting, that it's a fascinating and frustrating time for a condition like misophonia, in that awareness is growing considerably. The internet, the online communities, just general buzz about it has grown greatly, even in the last year or two, and yet we don't have diagnostic criteria. We don't have insurance codes for it. Patients are oftentimes being the educators to their clinicians who they have gone to treat. And, there's a lot of frustration about the process of getting those things done. And we have to, as a nonprofit that is kind of involved in research, we try to let people know that a lot of work is being done, and it has to be done right. And coming up with diagnostic criteria is a very complicated, years-long process, and then getting it published is an even longer process. So these things are moving along, but maybe not as quickly as we hoped. And what is your kind of take on, if somebody has misophonia, they can't really get a official diagnostic because those criteria don't exist, but they can get, again, this is layperson's terms, a soft diagnosis using some of the existing assessments like the Amsterdam scale, the Sussex scale, any of those that exist, in order to get things like job accommodations or so forth. What do you recommend to your participants and clients who have misophonia, who are stuck in this limbo of, we know it's a real thing, it's being researched, there's a whole department that you had, there's a whole department at Duke that's studying this, but the other parts of the process are taking a while to catch up and become more official. What is your take on what you would recommend there?
Yeah, I think one aspect is to try to work with someone who understands it. This, as you pointed out, is really difficult. And there are so many providers who either don't get it, or they're a hammer and everything's a nail in terms of their approach. And so it's a little bit challenging. But I also think perseverance is one way of trying to overcome that. And if there's some silver lining of COVID, I think it's been this appreciation that we can now practice via telehealth, within states at least, and some movement towards cross-state practice and licensure. So I think that's one piece. Second piece is to get involved, and again, meetings like this, research projects, but I think that is an important piece, and what really has also driven a lot of work. One of our grants that we recently received, we started right before COVID, and ended up having to completely change this and make it an online grant, where we ended up, it's going to be as good, but boy, we lost a little bit of hair on that one. But when we opened up the doors, I mean, it was like a flood of people who were all invested. And that was incredibly touching from the scientific side, because you'll have your ideas and hypotheses, but we need kind of that reciprocal involvement. And so that part was really, really hopeful. I think the third thing I would say, Chris, is hope. As I mentioned, I really started my career as an individual who worked in OCD, and so over the years I reached out to conditions that are not OCD, misophonia being one of those. Working with individuals with autism who may have anxiety, may have OCD is another domain. But when I think of OCD, what was interesting is that about 20 years ago, when I first started, there was nothing. Our basic behavioral treatment for children, the literature consisted of an open trial of 20 plus kids. That's it.
Wow.
And so we're at this point now, 20 years later, where 5 times a year I do a weekend training, where I have 30 clinicians come and I train them. And we do that with adults 5 times a year as well with one of my colleagues. And so the standard of care has dramatically improved. And so I think that aspect of hope is critical here. So for example, with regards to the diagnosis, we came out with a consensus paper that really was driven by the Ream Foundation and got people speaking the same language for the first time. And did a great job of getting people who maybe disagreed about some elements to either agree to disagree, and you moved on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was a step in the right direction. One of the projects that we have now with one of my faculty, Andrew Guzik, who's just remarkable, is all about setting the foundation for why this is important, which is critical in terms of getting NIH funding.
Mm-hmm.
And then the grant that we actually got in the first round of large grants from the Ream Foundation ended up leading to a current NIH grant that we received, and likewise we've had to have it on pause for about a year now because it requires being unmasked in a room, which that doesn't work too well
Right.
in that moment. But I think we're at that point where we're about to move past it. But the point is that a lot of things have happened that have resulted in change and movement in the right direction. And not to mention, not to focus just on our work, but as you pointed out, I mean, there are incredible folks like Zach Rosenthal at Duke and Jeffrey Brown, and I mean, so many really outstanding scientists and clinicians working in this space, all with a singular goal of trying to understand the problem and alleviate distress and suffering.
That's a great way of putting it, and I try to keep that in mind as well. As a nonprofit, we have a lot of people who ask questions. There's a lot of people who take to Twitter and so forth who are just desperate. They're struggling with school and everything, and the patience is the hard part. But these things do take time, and luckily, things have improved a lot. Awareness is. I first started experiencing what we now know as misophonia back in the 1980s, if not earlier. There was no regard for it being a disorder or anything. I just had a weird aversion to movements and sounds back in the early 80s. And nobody had any cognizance that it was a thing. There was no name for it. I had never met anybody else who had this. And it was depressing. You can kind of get down in an isolation hole thinking that you can't really do a whole lot in life, your social life, business, school, and all of that. And we're in a great time where it's very easy to find other people and who can validate your experience, who have the same experiences or similar experiences as you. And that is just so, I remember the first time I ever met somebody else who had misophonia and we talked about it. I was just deeply moved. I was, just couldn't, I was beside myself. It's such a validating thing. So we are in a good time, and that patience is the hard part, I think.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And when I made a comment about New York, I didn't disclose that I'm a New Yorker, and can't go back to small apartments with high ceilings and crown molding, but still are
Hmm.
about 400 square feet. But I think that impatience is a factor I share, but also something that's sort of motivating. And I suspect on it, really everyone on this call. I mean, it's this drive to try to understand and improve. And I think the sophistication of science has gotten to a point where we're seeing gains that are not just incremental, but pretty large steps. Um, and and together with advocates who are saying the status quo is not sufficient,
Hmm.
that's what gives me optimism for understanding treatments, for getting coverage from insurance payers, things like that.
Absolutely. And that's what keeps me going, and why I started a nonprofit, is that there's so much still left to be done, and things are getting better every day. But it's amazing to see the work that's happening. It's amazing, that you decided to, when you first probably were researching and looking into misophonia, it was probably called a rare condition, like something that was very unusual and rare. Now that awareness is spread, we know that that is not the case at all. It actually is probably a lot more common than we think. And so, you were a pioneer in getting that early research done that has gotten us to where we are now. Um, and on my end and on your end and everybody else's end, the awareness that it's been billed in the media way too much as a hatred of sounds. It's a lot more complicated
Yeah.
than that, and it affects every aspect of our lives. And the more we learn about it, every new study that comes out, I try to read them and understand them, brings up a lot of new questions and new directions to go with it. So what you're working on right now is the characteristics. You called it phenotyping, which is a term that I am kind of new to as a non-scientific person. Um, and I'll post a, link to your study that's ongoing right now regarding this characterization. Can you tell us a little bit more about what led to that and where we are and where it's headed?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm thrilled. I mean, we really have a couple main studies that are going on, and um, the phenotyping study is one where we're at this beautiful, pretty nerdy point of analyzing data and writing things up for publication. But what what was clear, what was immediately clear, is that we didn't have a clear understanding of what misophonia was. So if you take it on multiple domains, there were measures that a variety of measures, some of which were not the best, some of which were good. Like, for example, you quoted the Amsterdam, which is really based on a measure that my mentor and I created, the Yale-Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Scale,
Hmm.
in terms of kind of understanding the nature and severity of misophonia. But there are a lot of other questions that were going on, and there was a dearth of research on children as well. And so what we were seeing clinically was that you could see an individual with misophonia, and you saw an individual with misophonia. There were incredible differences among people, not surprising, but you were missing something if you tried to group everyone together simply based on the presence of misophonia symptoms.
Hmm.
And so, what we wanted to do was really try to tease apart uh, what misophonia looks like. And we wanted to do it in a variety of ways, trying to understand different kind of behavioral markers of as one outcome. We also wanted to look more intensely at and objectively at the way in which misophonia presents. So, what we've done, or what we did, and then are working on again in subsequent NIH project that involves people with misophonia and a broad array of other psychological problems, is we took the technology that is embedded within your iPhone, in which it can recognize your face to unlock. Now, that technology is pretty basic overall. It just essentially affixes pixels on and recognizes your face pretty roughly. And you have someone look like you, yeah, there you go. My kids told me I look like The Rock the other day. And so I did want to check out if they're using drugs, because I don't think we look at all alike. But maybe if The Rock and I both, looked at my phone, we could unlock.
Could open it, yeah.
Yeah, but we took that and so we did a couple things with it. Within this project, we made it much more fine-grained, and so there's hundreds of pixels that then kind of map onto every muscle in your face. And so when you end up actually doing what you just did, you kind of moved your mouth, raised an eye, we're able to objectively look at that and then quantify that, and then contrast it with essentially how we know muscles move when you have an emotional response. In misophonia, we know that there are a variety of emotional responses that people have when confronted by a trigger. But we wanted to understand, does it differ? If someone's more angry or irritated by that, is that a different kind of presentation than someone who's disgusted or someone who has anxiety evoked? Then we wanted to pair that with a number of other different tasks that get at things like understanding one's ability to inhibit a response and understand, is that a helpful thing or not, or maybe it doesn't matter at all. So we looked at all of these different ways of characterizing the presentation, and then we also wanted to compare it to kids who are anxious. Now we compared it to anxiety mostly because we wanted to compare it to something that was active. If you compare kids with misophonia on all these outcomes relative to a bunch of kids who have nothing, like, that's not fair. So we wanted to sort of look at that and in contrast in terms of a variety of features. And so that's sort of where the study went. Right now, we meet weekly, and really, when you're an academic, I mean, these are the moments you wait for, where you've collected the data. Data are all clean. Your database, I mean, this looks like a beautiful kind of morass of numbers. But we're have generated a number of manuscripts that look at a variety of factors. And so some of those are more clearly characterizing this and trying to understand, well, everyone may share a diagnosis of misophonia. Maybe there are groups at play, and maybe those groups are things like misophonia and co-occurring difficulties regulating affect. Maybe it's misophonia and anxiety kind of grouped together. And so I think some of those will help us understand what some of the differences might be in terms of presentation, which then lends us or leads us to improved ability to personalize intervention, which is really kind of the ultimate goal of all this work.
Yeah, I've wondered about that just anecdotally. Again, this is purely speculation. If there aren't subgroups of types of misophonia underneath the big umbrella, being pretty active in online groups for people who experience misophonia, there's a lot of people who swear that there's this tie to trauma. So maybe there's a trauma exacerbated or induced type of misophonia, which would make sense. And then there's folks like me who don't have any particular trauma in our past, and we're a different subgroup. So this kind of work right now being done at this time is fascinating to me to see those possible things being picked out.
Agreed. I could not agree more, Chris. I think if we understand where the differences are, it allows us to develop interventions that are sort of modularized, if that's a word. But you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. And for some individuals, you'll have a much different approach, or you'll rely on different components relative to others. And so I think this is one of those first steps of understanding, what are some of these groups? And that's what we're hoping to accomplish.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. The other study that you have going on at the link that I put in chat is for I think some of the folks in the meeting right now might be interested in this because it's a very common question about how misophonia so much impacts an entire family. When we think of it's a family disease, we think of things like addiction and so forth, which absolutely are. And misophonia is being recognized as something that really involves either it affects the entire family, and when it's being treated and managed well, as best as we are understanding at this point, it also involves the entire family understanding it better and so forth. And can you tell me a little bit more about the work you're doing on that and the specific study you have going and where that is leading?
Yeah, absolutely. I had this experience 15 years ago, let's say, and it was vicarious. It wasn't. It was my buddy and I talking, and he was describing how he was interested in trichotillomania, body-focused repetitive behavior, and he wanted to go to NIH to get funding for this. And so he submitted a grant, and the reviewers came back and said, "Well, where's the evidence that this is a problem?" And and so he really thought about that for a second. And on the one hand, you want to kind of smack the reviewer in the head and say, "Are you kidding? Like, these poor kids, these poor adults are pulling out their hair, and some of them are eating it. This is a lot of anxiety. I mean, this is difficult stuff." But then he had a different response, fortunately. And his response was to say, "Okay, you want to see how impairing this is. I'm going to give you those data." And conducted a couple really nicely done studies in adults and in children with trich. And it was all about establishing impairment in multiple domains: family-based impairment, occupational, academic, interpersonal, distress-based, as well as characterizing the problem. And so was able to go back in about a year or so later and nail 2 grants, one for kids, one for adults.
Wow.
The part that really struck me was the fact that we didn't, among children, have that corresponding data. We weren't able to really make what was completely obvious to all of us. We couldn't effectively make that case to a funding agency, which is, this is really serious stuff.
Yeah.
We need to make an investment in this because there are people who are struggling. A lot of people are struggling. And so that was really kind of the basis for this. At the same time, boy, I know some things about some things, but the people on this call know a heck of a lot more about misophonia than I ever will. And so we wanted to take that participatory kind of researcher approach where we learn from you. And we ask families questions about what's getting in the way, what's worked, what are ideas, what are things that are acceptable or not acceptable. And so those are some of the core elements of this project that Dr. Andrew Guzik is really the PI on, and I'm fortunate to be one of his mentors.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's one of the things that I find it particularly fascinating is the misophonia community is younger than some of the other neurodivergent and other disorder communities. And so I like to eavesdrop on autism boards, ADHD boards, because they have a lot clearer idea of the terminology and things. This is just my take on what they as a group represent. And that's where the concept of neurodiversity and neurodivergence right now that is gaining a lot of momentum comes from. And so I'm curious to see that shape up. And I'm wondering from a researcher's standpoint, this is a good segue into the question that's in the chat right now. Karen asks, are there any subgroups with Tourette's? Going back to what you were just talking, I've thought a lot, because I don't know the answer, and I don't know that anybody knows this answer, is when it comes to anxiety disorders like PTSD, OCD, autism, and similar ones to that, there's something that's called stimming, and stimming is self-stimulation. You're probably familiar with this, but if people aren't, it is self-soothing mannerisms, sounds, and those all seem to be very common misophonia triggers. It's like the polar opposite. So for people who for whom stimming is self-soothing, as an accommodation and as a coping thing, they need to be able to do those, as I understand it. Whereas if they're in the same room as somebody with misokinesia or misophonia, they will be suffering. And just the puzzle piece oppositeness of those two things seem in great conflict. And I don't know if there's anything to that. It's just bizarre how those two things are so completely, one is soothing and one is the nemesis of soothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is interesting. And I put two emails in the chat. And just again, in case people are interested in sort of geeking out with us. The first one is related to that family-based study. And simple email works. Second one is a little different. And Chris, we had talked about this a while back via email, but we got a grant in OCD, so not misophonia, but a fair number of folks have anxiety, have OCD, have Tourette, and together with misophonia. And so in this case, we ended up getting a grant from NIH to look at genetics of OCD in Latin Americans, which we define as one grandparent out of four come from Latin America, Mexico, Central, South America, or the Caribbean. And so what is what's I think interesting about that and pertinent to your point is that a lot of these problems have this shared overlap. And so they manifest potentially differently, but really there's kind of shared genetic variability within these types of problems. Now, if you think about OCD, something where we're learning a bit more about the genetics, if you have a twin, a monozygotic twin, you have OCD, your twin who shares complete DNA has about a 50% chance of having that. There's a lot of other stuff going on there. And so I think some of this holds when we think about issues or points like, is there a group with Tourette and misophonia, or OCD and misophonia, or autism and misophonia? It's really a big old Venn diagram where there's massive overlap in everything. And so I think that's explaining why we see so much kind of co-occurrence of problems, at least in part. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that I think you really hit on well is that everyone's sort of different, and they learn ways of coping, very that can be very different for one person to the next. And so in some it may be self-stimming behavior. In others, it may be more of an avoidant pattern. In others, it's you sort of grin and bear it. And so I think one of the ways I think about is what's the purpose of the behavior, and is it adaptive? Is it getting in the way, or something that we really need to spend time and try to address?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I try to let people know from a layperson's standpoint that even though we don't have any proven treatments, there's been a few case studies where one thing has worked and another thing hasn't, but we don't have any proven treatments for misophonia. A lot of work and a lot of things can be done to live a happier or more or less anxiety-inducing life. You can make changes in your life and cope with it in a way that is healthy. Short of, we don't have any medications yet to give you. We don't have any. There's no EMDR. I mean, there's been research into EMDR on misophonia, but we don't know if that works yet. So short of that, we're in this weird time where I try to let people know that it is possible to have you might have to make some big changes and really be honest, but it's a pretty rewarding life with misophonia. So, which is a nice segue, and then we can kind of wrap up. I wanted to kind of segue into the Knox County case, which I know you had mentioned in the email. This is a student who is in a court case for misophonia accommodations at school. If somebody needed those kinds of accommodations at work or school, how do you talk to them? How do you recommend that, short of getting an official diagnosis without any sort of diagnostic criteria, what would you do for somebody who maybe is saying, I'm really struggling at school and I need help, and so what can we do that would be valid?
Mhm. I think, boy, I really wish I had a better answer, and better in the sense of more successful answer with a greater chance of success.
Mhm.
Um, I think one is be the squeaky wheel, and advocate for your children, particularly when they can't advocate for themselves. Uh, Now, the challenge is that some schools absolutely get it, and are supportive. Some don't, and at that point, it really becomes a difficult position, because you can't, you know, roll over. But at the same time, by virtue of becoming, kind of loud, and fierce, and a mama bear or papa bear, it ends up, getting the school sort of defensive and upset. And so I think these are some of the challenges at play. From a strategic standpoint, I think it helps to have an advocate within the school.
Mhm.
I think it could be helpful to bring an external advocate in, um, and and all that to say, there's still plenty of places where that just doesn't matter, where they sort of miss out on what's best for the kids and what the role of the school is in education. And so that's sort of what I meant about that. I mean, really, that frustrating part of it. That
Yeah, and it unfortunately it comes from there's a big prove it mentality out there. Like I can't show you a test that proves I have misophonia. You have to take my word for it. But luckily I'm sure you've done this. I've written advocacy letters on behalf of people with misophonia. I'm happy to do that for anybody who reaches out to me whose kid is struggling or who is struggling at work. I've written quite a few of them. I'm happy to do that for free at any time. Um, just to explain to other people, as somebody who is other than the student and or the worker who's asking for the accommodations, to let people know that it's a real thing. It affects everything we do. But it is an uphill battle, and you never know how it's going to go. I've at previous employers had very good luck with them getting it, allowing me to have accommodations right away. We've seen some schools that say, "Oh yeah, no food in the classroom while you're there, no problem," and that's all there is to it, and it's done. And then there's others like this Knox County case, which I'll post a link to here, where they just won't budge, and it's gotten to a court case just because they won't implement a policy like that. So we've been posting on slash Knox on our website all of the court
Mhm.
documents from that case if anybody's interested in reading those. It's pretty fascinating and heartbreaking how much this one student is struggling with the law in their school district just to get basic accommodations. So we'll see. All right, we've got about 13 minutes left. Dr. Storch, what's next on the horizon for you? I know you're always you're very busy and very active in the misophonia research community. You've got two really exciting and interesting studies underway right now through the summer, I believe. And what's next after that? Is there anything else that you're excited to get started, maybe in the fall? Or
Yeah, well, I'm sure, sure hope so. So one of our projects, as you mentioned, finishes up, but then Andrews keeps going for the next couple years or so.
oh wow,
Um, Now, so that's one piece. One of the other things that we have a grant submission in, and we won't know for a month or two, but it's focused on genetics. And I think Maya had asked something in the chat that popped up quickly. So we're hopeful that that ends up getting funded, and would really be focused on kind of getting families together. We call them trios, where you have a person affected, and then their mom and dad, ideally. And that's a really powerful way of understanding genetics of things like misophonia. One of the things I think so important is being able to really characterize people with the problem, and characterize them well. So, for example, 23andMe is really impressive and really exciting, except what they count as misophonia is a pretty weak assessment of that. And so we're hoping to be able to do a much better job at understanding misophonia, and then the genetic contribution at play. So that's one area. Um, A second is to start really thinking about treatment. A couple years ago, I read a paper among individuals with autism, and the paper was really impactful to me. And it wasn't complicated, but all they did was they asked people who were struggling with, I'm sorry, who had autism, what their preferred and less preferred treatments were. And so they gave a list of both. One of the ones they hated was applied behavioral analysis. And that has a pretty strong footing in the autism community. So I thought a lot about that. And so we actually did a similar paper that is under review right now that did the exact same thing, where we just asked, people what they thought. And so we ended up finding some good data, that things like direct exposure was not a very acceptable treatment. That's important. We need to know that, but that other aspects like, learning how to map misophonia and sort of push back against it was an important piece. And learning ways of coping and contending with distress was also important. So we're hoping to take some of this information and start building out, kind of psychosocial types of models. And we've had some experience working on this in kind of parallel conditions like Tourette's syndrome, where it was all about helping people to live with their tics, is what we called it. And so thinking about it from that standpoint is, I think, one of our next domains as well. Yeah, I think, and I'm just thinking out loud, on an educational standpoint and an advocacy standpoint, I think the educational piece is what follows closely after we establish interventions that work. So one of the things I love to do, and I mentioned this, was train clinicians in treating children with OCD. And so we're clear. My cat was very excited about that, if you could hear. But we're clear about what works there. And so we're trying to get it out to people. And so I think that's a step that we're going to see happen in the next few years as we get more and more information about approaches that are effective. And so one of the papers we're working on now with a med student that works with me, who's a constant reminder that I would never get into graduate school if I was competing with the likes of him, Seth Madsen, is a systematic review of the treatments that exist and sort of where the gaps are and where we need to go, and trying to isolate some of the components that we think might work. And so the good is that, okay, there's a lot of room, and the bad is exactly the same thing, but we're seeing directions and ways that can be helpful. And then related to that is the fact that there's some brilliant neuroscientists out there who are doing such outstanding work in this space, which I try my best to consume, but never do a sufficient job. But I think what's optimistic about that is that it really drives discovery in a way that's different than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we really, we're sort of, it's like, okay, let's compare A to B, and then we're happy that A beat B. Here, we're really getting at the why, and I think that's going to help advance different things. And I see there are a few questions in here, and I'm going to try to respond to them. So I think that Destiny asks, interest in collaboration with the industry for education and advocacy. Absolutely. I think industry is, you have to be open to the various ways of getting the word out, whether it's education, advocacy, training, or so on. And I think in a lot of ways, figuring out how to seed different endeavors and demonstrate their success is critical to be able to keep things going. So I think any viable partner is exactly that. In terms of trying to accomplish whatever those goals are. I think Karen's point about the DSM, that's where I'm hoping. APA just came out with a DSM-5 text revision, which is, I think, their way of trying to get everyone to buy a new book. But sorry, if you could see here, we're in the process of moving into our new home. So we're getting all the cats who are a little bit distraught by this. So you may have heard one of them. Right, that's it, you heard it. Sorry about that. But I think that's absolutely a target for DSM-6, which I'm sure is 5-10 years away at this point. But with that comes people getting engaged in the research piece, and helping, to kind of establish, what the disorder looks like, the condition looks like, what, interventions might work, and so on. So bottom line is, I think we're moving in that right direction. I think the consensus paper was really a big step in terms of having everyone speak the same language, and more clearly characterize misophonia. And I think that will be a really nice jumping off point for future studies, as well as really this kind of strong contingent of, I mean, they're not pilot studies, they're more than that, but studies that set the foundation for why we need to study this. Chelsea asked about, right, why would it go in DSM? A lot of conditions really are neurological that are in DSM. And so I think, that's it's a fair question. Tourette is a perfect example. And in some ways, I sort of think of it along that line. At the same time, there's an ICD code right now, and so it may just persist within that. I think what's key is that, misophonia in and of itself, to me, is not a psychological condition. I think a lot of people experience co-occurring psych conditions, and it's unclear why that may be and how they're related at this point. But there may be considerations about where it best fits at the same time. All right. And then Peggy asks, right, about beta blockers. I tell you, in that system, it's a great question. In that systematic review that we're working on, what was incredibly apparent, so overall, were the dearth of good studies out there on any treatment. So that's sort of first. There's one nice randomized controlled trial out of Amsterdam that did a really lovely job with a psychosocial intervention, but that's one study in a relatively modest sample among adults. The med side of it was scant, and it's not really clear why that is. But at the same time, you could see there being a conceptual reason why beta blockers might work. But right now, really, it's all about, case study level data with antidepressants primarily being the focus. So the reality with case studies is that if it doesn't work, you don't publish it. If it does work, you think it's novel, then you try to publish it. So it's a very, very weak source of data overall. All right. Carolyn asked about a database of therapists and doctors that specialize in working with folks with misophonia. And then, right, the second issue. I suspect, although I don't want to put Chris on the spot or others on the spot, but there are some incredible advocates who I suspect know of some of the providers at play. Chris, of course, and Jennifer Brout has done some amazing work in terms of advocacy as another potential option. But at this point, I don't know I don't know the database. I think that would be one area that I would imagine as would be a really exciting kind of direction, is trying to establish that. So some of the organizations to which I belong, the International OCD Foundation or the Tourette Association of America, or the Trichotillomania Learning Center. That's one of their core features to it. And, it's essentially, how do I find help? And so that's one piece. Another, though, is developing out the training acumen, and trying to build, the number of clinicians out there. And then a third is that advocacy. One of the conditions or subtypes of OCD that we've done some work on is pandas or pans. Thank you, Mary. That's I was blanking on the name, and Jennifer's organization is fantastic. But going back, I think one of the goals is trying to, in the case of pandas or pans, disseminate information, get it to the people who are going to encounter these kids. And so I think that would be another goal, is how do we get informational pieces out to the folks that are really most likely to be the first line, or the first person that someone with misophonia goes and sees. Is that an audiologist? Just as one example. Right. And Karen points out the TSA, where I think they were fired up when the TSA kind of came out because they had to change their name. I think that's a great model for how to do this.
I'm back. I apologize. This is a learning experience, and I realized that Firefox with Google Meet wasn't working, so I was trapped in my own little weird prison, virtual prison there for a while. But I'm back. I'm in Chrome. So thank you so much, Dr. Storch, for kind of taking over and vamping. That's a theater word, vamping, kind of filling in while somebody forgets their lines or doesn't make their entrance. But thank you for doing that. So I'm glad you were able to answer some questions. Those are fantastic questions. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to cover? It's a learning experience. Thank you for being patient with me while I come back in on a different browser.
No, I mean, the one thing, Chris, I'll say, I mean, the other thing I guess I love about COVID is, the fact that, you hear that was our kitten, Kitty, meow, meow.
I missed that.
She wasn't so excited about being picked up, but, there's an acceptance of the fact that we're all people as we get to see into one another's home, and hopefully you see how neat my home is behind me. But I will say, I don't want anyone to ever feel like you're alone. Don't hesitate to reach out and, email me, email our team. I mean, anything we can do to support folks. Don't always have the right answer, but we'll keep trying to figure it out.
Absolutely. And I support that. And I have been absolutely amazed at how that is so prevalent in the misophonia community. If I was having a hard time and I couldn't get a hold of somebody, that knew about my misophonia, I know I could call you, Dr. Storch, even though we just met. Anybody is welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to anybody. And I've found that almost universally throughout the misophonia community. There's always people posting on Instagram and Twitter, like, if you're struggling, DM me. I'm happy to talk to you. And that offer it's absolutely amazing. So I appreciate that. And again, I appreciate you taking some time. Like you said, you just closed on a new house. There's a lot going on as far as your work is concerned. I really appreciate you taking some time out. And I'm about to turn 48, so I kind of laugh off mistakes when I make them. I don't feel so embarrassed as I used to. But I appreciate everybody who is here tonight for being here tonight. You're actually being here to listen to Dr. Storch, to learn more about the misophonia research that he has done, that he and his department are doing, is participating in misophonia research itself. Now you can go forth and kind of share some of the things you've learned, and that's very important. Anything else? I will be sending out, even with the technical glitches, I'll be sending out a video link to this meeting tomorrow. I'll also send out a link to a survey of what we could improve, even technologically. But Dr. Storch, it has been an absolute pleasure to finally meet you. I'm surprised that I haven't had a chance to reach out and do that. And it's been a really great pleasure to hear about the work that you're doing. You're a legend in the misophonia research community. You know, when things are talked about, um, your name comes up a lot, and so I'm really glad that we got a chance to touch base and to learn a little bit about more of your phenotyping work and the work that you're doing. As somebody who suffered with misophonia for many years, maybe 40-ish years or more, it means so much to me that there are people like you who are dedicated to helping people like me, um, and finding out more about this bizarre thing that nobody understood, and a lot of people still don't understand, but we're learning more about. So thank you.
Oh, Chris, thank you for those words. That it touches my heart, and it's sort of the, it's the driver, and even nights like tonight, I mean, these are the things that sort of motivate you and give you that energy, because I will tell you, my life has become a series of nonstop Zoom meetings and paperwork.
Oh no.
So this is a joy, and I wish everyone all the best, and any way I can help support, um, you know, and the work that you're doing or the experiences that people are having, just an email away.
Yeah, same here. I've been in that deep dark depression hole because of misophonia and other things, and I don't ever want anybody in the audience or anybody that you know to ever be down there. I'm happy to talk to anybody at any time, to let them know that things can go well with a little bit of life adjustment. You can have a pretty good life with misophonia. So we'll be doing these pretty regularly. Again, I apologize for the technical glitches, but we'll be doing these science sessions regularly. They'll always be free. Anytime a new study comes out about misophonia from anybody, Dr. Storch's team, the Duke team, the Sussex team, or anybody else, there's a lot of great research from departments that haven't been doing misophonia research coming out. And that's exciting to see. We'll try to bring them on and have a Q&A just like tonight. As one South Texan, I'm from San Antonio, and Dr. Storch is in Houston. To another, thank you so much. Try to stay nice and cool. Everybody, I appreciate your being here. If you have any questions, feel free to email either of us after this. But everybody have a great rest of your evening, and we'll do this again soon.
All right, good night, everyone.
Take care.